Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about an author as well known as he is misunderstood. Well known because his name is so recognized that an adjective was even derived from it. Yet misunderstood because, in truth, that adjective poorly represents his philosophical doctrine. This author is Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine philosopher of the Renaissance, most notably known for his work The Prince, published in 1513. This text could be considered a kind of manual for rulers. Machiavelli's philosophy is essentially political. I say essentially because, as we will see, it's not purely political. It has a political purpose, a vocation, if you will, to define the art of governing. Governing, since antiquity, has been seen as managing and administering life in the city or in the community. Machiavelli's approach to governing deviates from the political norms that had been in place until his time. In my introduction, I mentioned that this author is misunderstood because he's often associated with the adjective Machiavellian, which doesn't accurately capture his doctrine. Machiavellian suggests a cunning, almost diabolical intelligence, a notion of malevolence and bad intentions. However, in Machiavelli's actual work, there's no inherent malice or intention to do harm for harm's sake. Instead, he suggests that in certain situations, evil might be a necessary tool to govern or retain power. Machiavelli developed a technical science, an art, aimed at securing and maintaining power. Now, I must note that any resemblance between what is described in this video and the reality of contemporary politics is purely coincidental. Naturally, Machiavelli's philosophy hasn't influenced rulers since the 15th century, and yes, I'm using irony here. Many political figures have recognized Machiavelli as a foundational reference, with The Prince even regarded as a bedside book by some. Machiavelli's influence on modern politics has been decisive precisely because his approach contrasts with older political philosophies, especially those of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Machiavelli is truly the founder of modern political philosophy. If we were to highlight a central idea in modern political philosophy, it would be realism. What do I mean by realism? Here, I'm not speaking of metaphysical realism, the doctrine that the world is a reality independent of our minds, as opposed to idealism, which sees the world as a mental construct. Instead, I refer to a kind of realism that entails accepting and working with reality as it is. Machiavelli's philosophy is grounded in this realistic assumption that we should consider people not as we would like them to be, but as they are. We must start with their actual nature, rather than trying to change them into something they are not. This realism is based on a particular view of human nature, a view that sees humans as fundamentally self-interested. Echoing Pascal, Machiavelli views people as incapable of pure altruism. Instead, they are motivated by self-love, interest, and selfishness. We might promote moral values or uphold ideals of virtue. But for Machiavelli, these efforts are futile because humans cannot rise to them. This realism involves acknowledging human nature's inherent selfishness and using it as a foundation for governance. For Machiavelli, this realism is unavoidably paired with pragmatism, the idea that results matter more than ideal values or principles. If the objective of politics is to govern, then we must begin with reality, the reality that people are driven by self-interest and prone to vice and passion. Since this is the nature of humanity, Machiavelli suggests we must work with it, using people's weaknesses to govern effectively. In the end, his goal is the retention of power, and facing reality head-on is the means by which we control the people. To illustrate how revolutionary Machiavelli's philosophy was for the 15th and 16th centuries, I'll present two examples, one from antiquity and another from the Middle Ages. The first example is Plato's Republic. Plato, a philosopher from the 5th century BCE, wrote this work on political philosophy, in which he outlined the foundations of an ideal society. Now, for the purists, it's worth noting that Plato doesn't use the term ideal city, but rather Callipolis, meaning the beautiful city. The beautiful city is a virtuous, harmonious city. A city that is not only functional, but also aligned with the principles of good. In the Republic, you'll find extensive discussions on virtue, morality, and the nature of goodness. For Plato, politics and morality are inseparable. The purpose of the city and its political structure is to guide citizens toward the pursuit of good. Plato's vision of the city is inherently oriented towards good, with the goal of embodying the concept of good in earthly society. In essence, the ideal of good, which is abstract, becomes represented in society through this harmonious city. Plato's political project, then, is inextricable from the idea that politics exists to promote higher ideals. Now, let's consider a second example from the 5th century CE, St. Augustine's City of God. In this work, St. Augustine contrasts two opposing types of societies. The first type is one driven by self-love, which he equates with vice. The second is a society founded on the love of God, which Augustine views as the ultimate political ideal. According to St. Augustine, the purpose of society is, quite simply, to save souls. Society should create an environment that helps people elevate themselves spiritually so that they may ultimately reach God. In this ideal, the end goal is for all individuals to attain salvation, a concept deeply rooted in the belief that a religious society should be governed by divine principles. And what do divine principles dictate? The epistemological break. In religious thought, earthly life is often seen as merely a passage. We're told that what truly has value, what truly has meaning, is eternal life, the life that comes after our time on earth. And how do we attain this eternal life? By living according to divine principles, by following God's commands, and adhering to the ideals of goodness. Once again, we find ourselves in a conception of politics that is inseparable from the idea of goodness, from a moral, philosophical, and religious ideal that forms the very cornerstone of the political system. This approach sees politics as an extension of moral duty, a means of guiding people toward higher, eternal values. This is where Machiavelli represents a clear break, an epistemological break, or more precisely, a paradigm shift. We are entering an entirely different world, a world where the idea of good is no longer central. Here, the concept of goodness is merely an option among many, and crucially, it should not form the foundation of political decision-making or the art of governing. On the contrary, Machiavelli sees basing politics on the idea of good as a futile endeavor. This reliance on goodness, he argues, is doomed to fail because it is fundamentally incompatible with human nature and ultimately self-destructive. If the true aim of politics is to secure and retain power, then political action cannot rely on the fragile assumption that people are inclined toward goodness or virtue, or that they will naturally follow divine commands. That's simply unrealistic. It won't work. There is no point in trying to cling to such illusions. This is the political realism of Machiavelli. The historical context. Let's take a moment to consider the historical context surrounding Machiavelli, particularly the Renaissance, a time often referred to as the dawn of modernity. Modernity marked a fundamental shift in how humans were viewed, transforming our understanding of human nature. This period saw the emergence of what some call anthropological pessimism. Anthropological pessimism, as Machiavelli understood it, is the notion that we should have no illusions about human nature. At its core, it posits that people are primarily driven by self-interest, impulses, and emotions. It rejects the idealized image of humans as inherently virtuous, and instead views humans as fundamentally selfish. Recognizing and accepting this reality allows leaders to use it to their advantage, embodying a kind of political opportunism. In essence, this political opportunism transforms self-interest, which had previously been seen as an obstacle to governance, into a resource for exercising power. This approach is akin to the practice of judo, where one uses an opponent's force to one's advantage. Machiavelli was not alone in embracing anthropological pessimism. Another significant proponent was the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. In his work Leviathan, Hobbes took a similar approach by analyzing human nature and concluding that people are primarily driven by selfish desires and governed by a fear of death. Hobbes believed that this fear was the only factor that could compel people to submit to authority and avoid chaos, thus justifying the state as a necessary protector. Both Machiavelli and Hobbes advocate for a political philosophy grounded in a realistic understanding of humanity. For Machiavelli, the goal of leadership is not to shape people into what they should be, but to understand them as they are in order to govern them effectively. Leaders must grasp what the people truly desire, not what they should desire. Machiavelli argues that to govern effectively, it is not necessary to fulfill people's desires, but to give them the impression that their desires are being met. Machiavelli's insights extend into the realm of human psychology. He contends that people respond more to appearances than to reality. They react emotionally rather than rationally. Thus, a skilled ruler is not someone who provides what the people want, but rather someone who makes the people believe they are receiving what they want. Governing, in Machiavelli's view, is an art of illusion where the ruler masters appearances because appearances shape opinions. The opinions of the populace are fundamental, as they provide the foundation upon which rulers can organize and maintain control. Machiavelli was keenly interested in psychology, especially in what were historically called humors, bodily fluids believed to influence mood and temperament. If humans are driven by emotions, a ruler doesn't need to act in the people's genuine interest. It is sufficient for the people to believe that their interests are being safeguarded. In Machiavelli's view, governing is not about moral or virtuous leadership, but about sustaining power. He dismisses the idea of guiding people toward goodness, focusing instead on the practical art of maintaining control. A ruler, Machiavelli argues, does not have time for moral illusions. His duty is to rule, not to moralize. This is the essence of Machiavelli's political realism. Machiavelli's two levers of power, sympathy and fear. Machiavelli identified two primary levers to compel obedience from the people: sympathy and fear. These levers correspond to the fundamental motivations in human behavior: love and fear. Sympathy, love. Sympathy, in Machiavelli's view, involves creating the impression of genuine care and concern for the people. The leader must appear to act in the people's best interest, striving to be loved. However, it's essential to note that this love is not necessarily sincere. It's the illusion of care that is important. Fear. Machiavelli, however, emphasizes that fear is a far more reliable foundation for power than love. He argues that while people may obey out of love, fear provides a stronger and more dependable motivation, as nothing is more deeply rooted in human nature than the fear of death. In Machiavelli's framework, most people will act out of fear, even when they would not act purely out of love. Therefore, he advocates for instilling a degree of fear to ensure obedience. Machiavelli was realistic about human nature, viewing the willingness to sacrifice or act heroically as rare, exceptional cases, unsuited as a foundation for political order. For him, political action must be grounded in the general, predictable tendencies of human behavior, primarily the fear of death and self-preservation, a pragmatic approach to morality. For Machiavelli, morality was not a constraint. Politics, he believed, is entirely separate from morality. He saw no inherent conflict in using both moral and immoral strategies, depending on what best served his goal of maintaining power. If, in a given situation, morality could be used to govern effectively, he would adopt it. If immorality served the purpose better, he would choose that path instead. This pragmatic, rational approach defines Machiavelli's philosophy. His sole focus is on effectiveness, What strategy most efficiently increases and secures influence over the people? Moral judgments of good and evil are secondary to the practical aim of effective governance. This approach to power has led to Machiavelli's enduring legacy as the originator of a distinctly pragmatic, morally flexible approach to politics.